The morning they showed up, I was in the backyard oiling the hinges on Carla's old garden bench. It was one of those mild spring mornings where the air still holds a bit of winter's chill, but the sky promises something warmer. I remember the way the birds went silent when I heard the car doors slam. Not one door, 3. Then the sound of a trunk opening, rubber wheels scraping the gravel. Voices too loud for a Sunday. I wiped my hands on my handkerchief and rounded the corner of the house. There they were. My daughter Lena standing like she had just conquered something, her husband Darren barking instructions while pulling suitcase after suitcase out of their SUV, and the grandkids, eyes glued to their screens, already sitting on my porch swing like they owned it. No phone call, no letter, no warning. Just there. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 76 years old, and until that morning, I thought I had finally carved out a quiet life after losing my wife, Carla, 6 years ago. We bought this house in Oak Ridge Bluff back in the early 80s. 2 stories, slanted roof, white shutters, and a narrow porch that creaked just right under your feet. We raised Lena here, built a garden, held anniversaries and wakes and Sunday dinners. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that we had endured. What I'm about to admit isn't something that comes easy to a man like me. But here it is. I let them stay, even when every part of me knew I shouldn't have. They said their condo was being renovated. Just a short stay, Lena assured me with a tired smile. But Darren wouldn't even look me in the eye. He acted like it had all been arranged beforehand, like I was just another spare key under the mat. And maybe I was. Maybe I'd let myself become one without realizing it. All I know is that from that moment on, nothing inside that house belonged to me anymore. Not the bed I slept in, not the food in the fridge, not even the silence I used to count on. I didn't know it yet, but I was already being replaced. And that was the last time I'd ever be caught off guard. By the second night, I was sleeping downstairs. It happened without a real conversation. Darren just walked up the staircase with one of the bigger suitcases and never came back down. Lena trailed after him with a stack of folded towels and that strained look on her face she always wears when she's pretending something isn't happening. I waited. Thought maybe someone would come down and ask if I needed help moving anything, or if I had a preference. But no one did. I stood in the kitchen watching the light from the master bedroom flicker behind the blinds upstairs. My room. The room Carla and I shared for nearly 4 decades. Lena came down after a while and smiled like everything was fine. She told me it would be easier for everyone if I just took the guest room on the ground floor. Fewer stairs, she said. More convenient. She used that word a lot those first few days. Convenient. As if my life were something to be streamlined or folded away for easier storage. I didn't argue. I nodded and shuffled into the guest room with my reading lamp and toothbrush. I didn't bring Carla's photo. I couldn't. The next morning I found my chair, Carla's chair really, pushed out into the garage like an afterthought. In its place was one of those modern pieces that looks nice in magazines but doesn't hold a body right. It didn't have the little dip in the cushion where I used to rest my coffee mug on Sunday mornings while reading the paper. No one said anything. No one asked if I minded. I opened the fridge and half my food was gone, replaced by things I couldn't pronounce. Vegan yogurts and boxed salads and some sort of drink that came in a charcoal-colored bottle. I made myself toast, but even the bread tasted different. I checked the trash can. My rye loaf had been thrown out. Darren started using my truck without asking. Said it was better than renting a car while his was being detailed. Lena laughed when I raised an eyebrow and called it borrowing. Said I didn't drive much anyway, so what did it matter? I watched him pull out of my driveway, blasting music through the open windows, sunglasses on like he belonged here more than I did. At dinner, I stopped trying to keep up. The conversation moved too fast and too sideways. Everything was about school pickups, renovation schedules, Darren's networking calls, and Lena's yoga certification. No one asked about my day or whether I'd made it to the hardware store like I'd planned. I cleared my plate quietly and went back to the guest room, where the mattress squeaked every time I turned over. That night I stared at the ceiling and realized I couldn't even hear the waves anymore. The house felt smaller and louder all at once, like I was just a tenant waiting for the real owners to hand me a notice. I first noticed it when I went to the hallway upstairs, hoping to grab one of Carla's shawls from the closet. The air had that familiar lavender scent she always loved, soft and clean, like she had just been there. But when I opened the closet, I found her things stuffed into 2 cardboard boxes marked Misski. Her favorite blue coat, the one she wore every Thanksgiving, was crumpled under a pile of scarves. Her church hat was crushed on the side like someone had sat on it. The cedar chest where she kept our letters had been pushed to the corner and left half open. I stood there for a long time. The floor under my feet felt less steady than it used to. When I finally carried the boxes downstairs to ask what had happened, Darren didn't even glance up from his phone. He said they were making room for shared storage and that they figured I wouldn't mind, since I never went in there anymore. Lena was in the kitchen arranging a bouquet, smiling like she always did when she wanted to pretend things were normal. She said they were just organizing, and that Carla's things would be safer downstairs where I could access them more easily. That same day, the wedding photo from our 30th anniversary went missing from the mantel, replaced by a minimalist print of a beach landscape that Darren said looked cleaner and more modern. The little porcelain angel Carla loved, the one she bought on our first trip to Savannah, disappeared entirely. I found it later in the bottom drawer of the guest room dresser, chipped and dusty. At dinner that night, the kids asked why there were so many old pictures in the house. Darren said it was time to make the place feel more current. I looked at Lena, hoping she'd speak up, say something to remind them this wasn't just any house. But she just sipped her sparkling water and said it was probably for the best if the house didn't feel like a museum. I didn't eat much, just pushed my food around the plate and stared at the table that used to host Sunday roasts and late-night tea. Carla used to sit at the head, humming softly while she passed the butter. Now the chairs were all mismatched, and my spot had been quietly reassigned to the end, next to the trash bin. That night I went to the garage where they'd stacked the boxes. I sat on an overturned paint bucket and opened one slowly. Inside was Carla's music box, still wrapped in tissue paper. When I wound it, the melody was slow, a bit warped, but still hers. I let it play out in the dark, the faint notes echoing against the cold concrete. It hit me then. They weren't just moving things around, they were pulling up roots, repainting memory. And Carla was being packed away like she'd never lived here at all. Dinner used to be something I looked forward to. Carla and I had a rhythm to it. She'd cook while I set the table. Even after she passed, I kept the habit. A small plate, 1 fork, 1 knife, folded napkin, and always a candle. I didn't need the light, but I liked the sense of occasion. It made the silence feel chosen, not forced. Now the table was always full, but somehow quieter than ever. Lena and Darren talked, but it wasn't to me. Their conversations curled around me like steam, never touching. Schedules, school issues, gym memberships, Darren's latest client lunch, Lena's yoga poses. It was like listening to a podcast where I was never invited to speak. The kids stared at their tablets unless they were being scolded. Even the clinking of silverware felt performative, as though they were eating to fill the air, not their stomachs. Once I tried to join in. They were talking about a new juice bar opening downtown, and I mentioned the old bakery that used to be there, the one where Carla and I bought her birthday cakes. Darren cut in without looking up and said, "Yeah, they tore that down years ago. Progress, right?" And then kept going, like I hadn't said a word. Lena smiled at me vaguely, the kind of smile people give when they're too polite to yawn in your face. The worst part wasn't what they said. It was how they didn't say anything to me. They never asked how my day was, never noticed when I didn't eat. I stopped bothering to bring out a full plate and instead started making toast or a small bowl of soup, something I could finish quickly and leave the room without drawing attention. It became easier to disappear before they did it for me. One night, Darren asked if I'd mind eating in the den so the kids could do their homework at the table. "They just focus better without extra noise," he said. I was already halfway out of my chair before I realized he meant me. I nodded. What else could I do? I took my bowl of stew to the den and sat with the television off, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and forks tapping behind the closed door. Even the dog, which they brought along despite my allergies, seemed to forget I existed. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. Not out of vanity, just to confirm I was still there. Lines deeper than I remembered, eyes duller. I looked like someone who had already moved out, even though I still had a key. I was living in my own home like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. Every ritual I had with Carla, every habit, was being replaced by noise and indifference. And the house, once so full of memory, now held echoes that no one else could hear. It was late, sometime after 10. I had just finished folding a few shirts and was about to head to bed when I realized I'd left my mug in the kitchen. I patted down the hallway quietly, not wanting to wake anyone, but I heard voices drifting from the living room. The TV was off. The tone was hushed but urgent, the kind of low pitch people use when they're saying something they know they shouldn't. I paused near the edge of the hallway, just out of view. Darren was talking first, pacing by the fireplace. He said he'd spoken to someone about a room layout, something about converting the old man's guest room once he was moved out. Lena was curled on the couch, her voice tight. She said, "We already paid the deposit. They said they'd hold the room for 60 days. My stomach turned. I stayed completely still. They weren't talking about renovating the house. They were talking about me. Darren mentioned a facility just outside Rehoboth. It's close, it's clean, and they've got medical staff on site. Honestly, it's the best option if we're serious about staying here long term." Lena didn't push back. She just said, "Do you think we can convince him it's his idea?" That was the part that stayed with me. Not the decision itself, not even the money, but the idea that they were plotting how to make me walk out on my own 2 feet, thinking it was my choice. I backed away, careful not to creak the floorboards. My hands were shaking when I reached the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cup of pills on my nightstand. Carla used to lay them out for me each night just to be sure I took them. I hadn't missed a dose since she died, but that night I came close. I thought of the room they described. Fluorescent lights, white walls, maybe a window that opened halfway if you were lucky. I thought about losing the sounds of the inlet at night, the way the wind whispered through the trees out back. I pictured the house without me in it. Lena laughing in the kitchen, Darren reorganizing furniture again, and someone else calling this place home. Someone else sleeping in the room where Carla and I used to hold hands before drifting off. The betrayal didn't come like a knife. It came like a slow drip. I sat there for over an hour, listening to the distant murmur of their voices fade into the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of settling wood. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was hurt in a way I hadn't felt since Carla's diagnosis. And that was when I understood something they hadn't. They thought I was old enough to be moved like furniture, forgotten like paperwork. But I was still Walter Briggs, and they just reminded me exactly how much I had left to lose. The next morning, I didn't go through the usual routine. No coffee, no oatmeal, no half-hearted attempts to join their conversation. I sat by the window in the guest room, watching the light move slowly across the floorboards. Carla used to say that morning light in this house made everything feel honest. That day, it felt like a searchlight, asking me what I planned to do next. I didn't need long to answer. By noon, I was in the attic, moving slowly but with purpose. I had to lean on the railing a few times and take a breath, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. Carla had been meticulous with paperwork, everything in labeled folders stored in an old cedar chest that still smelled faintly of her rose oil. The moment I pulled the file marked property from the stack, my fingers started tingling. Inside were the original closing documents from 1983, a copy of the loan discharge letter from 1997, and most importantly, the deed. I held it in both hands, smoothing it flat across the lid of the chest. My name, Walter Joseph Briggs, typed in firm black ink. Carla's name right beneath mine. No additions, no co-owners, no signatures from Lena or Darren. I stared at it until the light started to shift again, casting the corners of the attic in shadow. I sat back against a box of Christmas decorations and let the weight of it settle. They hadn't checked. Darren, so confident and smug, hadn't even bothered to confirm who actually owned the house he was rearranging. He assumed age meant weakness, that gray hair came with memory loss or blind trust. But I remembered everything. I remembered every payment, every coat of paint, every time Carla and I stood in the doorway after a storm to check for leaks. This place wasn't just mine in ink. It was mine in blood, in laughter, in silence, in grief. That night I laid the deed out on the small desk in my room and looked at it again. I ran my thumb along the edge and thought about how quiet Carla would be in a moment like this. Not angry, not loud, just sure. She always knew when to be still and when to act. I imagined her standing in the doorway, arms crossed gently, waiting for me to decide. By the time the house grew quiet and the others had gone to bed, I had made up my mind. They thought they were moving me out, one decision at a time, but they forgot whose name was on the line. I folded the deed carefully, slid it into a new envelope, and placed it beneath my pillow. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had something better. Proof. Proof that I still had a claim to this life, this house, this history. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking. The next morning, I made a call I hadn't made in years. His name was Raymond Torres, a man I met back in my early days at the Postal Service. We spent nearly 3 decades sorting mail, braving icy roads in winter, and carrying bags that seemed to get heavier as we got older. Ray retired 2 years before I did, moved down to a smaller place in Milford, but we kept in touch on birthdays and holidays. When Carla died, he was one of the few who came by regularly. Not to pry, not to comfort, just to sit. Sometimes that's the best kind of company. He picked up after 2 rings. I didn't dance around it. I told him Lena and Darren had moved in, that things were shifting under my feet, and that I had a deed with my name on a deed, but no idea what to do next. He didn't ask for details, just said, "Come by tomorrow. I think I know someone." The drive to Milford was quiet. I took my old truck, the one Darren said was past its time, and rolled the windows down halfway. The road curved through stretches of pine and open field, and for a while I could pretend everything was still the same. At Ray's house I was greeted like no time had passed. Same wooden porch, same ceramic rooster by the front steps. He poured 2 cups of black coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table like we always used to on our break days. Ray told me about his nephew, Marcus. Said the boy was sharp, honest, and used to dealing with non-traditional property cases. Divorces, estate claims, inheritances, tangled in family drama. Marcus didn't scare easily. Ray said he could trust him to keep things quiet. I agreed to meet him that afternoon. Marcus was in his 30s, wore a checkered shirt, and carried a folder thicker than his arm. He listened carefully, never interrupting, and took notes with a kind of calm I hadn't seen in years. When I handed him the deed, he read it twice, nodded slowly, and said, "They really didn't check this, did they?" I shook my head. He asked me what I wanted to do. Sell, reclaim, evict? I told him I wasn't sure yet, only that I wanted to make a move before they made theirs. He leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "Then let's make sure you hold the pen when it's time to sign anything." He promised to start discreet inquiries. No listings, no public signs, just quiet conversations with people who understood discretion. I told him I didn't want drama. I just wanted my life back. When I left Ray's house, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control, not revenge, not anger. Just the calm that comes from knowing you've taken the first real step. I wasn't out yet, but I wasn't cornered either. And that made all the difference. Marcus worked fast. Within a week, he'd spoken to 3 potential buyers. All of them were wealthy enough not to need financing and patient enough to wait through what he delicately referred to as a delicate transition. I appreciated the way he talked. No pressure, no fast deals, just facts and respect. He understood that this wasn't just a transaction for me, it was a turning point. The third buyer, a woman named Sylvia Lang, caught my attention. She was in her early 60s, recently widowed, and looking to downsize from her estate in Annapolis. She wanted something coastal, quiet, with character. Marcus arranged a private walkthrough while Lena and Darren were out at a weekend farmer's market. I stayed behind and greeted her at the door, nervous at first, but that feeling passed the moment she stepped inside and took it all in. Sylvia didn't comment on the peeling paint or outdated cabinets. Instead, she asked about the tree in the backyard, the one Carla and I planted after Lena was born. She noticed the worn path leading to the bench by the inlet and smiled when she saw the old shelf of mystery novels I kept by the fireplace. It wasn't about resale value for her. It was about living. When I explained the situation, I was honest. I told her I was still living in the house, but would be displaced soon. I told her it was still my name on the deed, and that I intended to sell under one condition: I would remain on the property in the guest house out back. It wasn't much. A one-bedroom cottage Carla and I had used for visitors, with its own small kitchen and a porch that caught the evening sun. I told her I needed nothing more than that. Just space. Just peace. She nodded slowly, said it was generous considering the circumstances, and then surprised me by asking if I'd be willing to stay on as a caretaker of sorts. Someone to keep the garden going, keep an eye on the place when she traveled. I said yes before she finished the sentence. It felt right, like something Carla would have smiled at. A soft landing. Marcus drew up the paperwork that same week. Quiet, binding, airtight, no public listing, no family alert, just a clean, legal transition, handled with the kind of care Darren would never have imagined. When the documents were signed, I sat alone in the guest house with a cup of coffee and watched the wind move through the tall grass. For the first time in months, I felt rooted again. Not to the house, not to the things they'd taken or rearranged, but to a choice. My choice. Lena and Darren had counted on me fading into the background. Instead, I had placed myself precisely where I needed to be. And I hadn't even told them yet. The invitation wasn't meant for me. I found the flyer taped to the fridge door one morning, printed on glossy paper with gold accents and Darren's usual flair for the dramatic. A celebration of family, it read, followed by his parents' names in oversized font. The date was set for the coming Saturday, and from the looks of the list written in Lena's careful handwriting, they were expecting close to 50 people. No one asked me if that was all right. No one even checked to see if I'd be around. It was assumed, as always, that I would stay out of sight. They had already taken over the main living room and the back deck with extra tables and folding chairs. Darren hired a catering service, and Lena spent 2 days trying out different music playlists for background ambiance. That week, I kept to the guest house more than usual. Sylvia had already signed the paperwork, and Marcus had confirmed that the sale was officially recorded. The ink was dry. All that was left was to choose the moment. On the day of the party, the house looked polished and unfamiliar. White tablecloths, silver utensils, floral arrangements in every room. I stood at the window of the guest house, watching them laugh as they organized wine glasses and set out decorative candles. Darren strutted like a man who'd built the walls himself, greeting the catering crew and pointing at spots for trays and drink stations. Lena moved quietly behind him, fixing centerpieces and adjusting everything he left slightly off balance. The guests arrived around 4. Expensive cars lined the driveway and spilled out onto the gravel road. I watched from a distance as Darren's parents stepped out of a silver sedan, greeted like royalty. The whole scene played like something out of a brochure, the kind meant to sell you an idea of family that glossed over the truths buried underneath. I waited until the music had started and the first round of drinks had been served. Then I picked up the folder Marcus had given me and walked slowly up the back path to the house. Sylvia followed behind, dressed neatly but unassuming, carrying nothing but her purse and the quiet authority that came from owning something without needing to prove it. When I stepped into the yard, heads turned. Conversation stumbled. Darren saw me first, and his grin faltered. Lena looked up from the patio table and froze. Her glass tilted slightly in her hand. I greeted a few familiar faces, neighbors who hadn't seen me in weeks, and then introduced Sylvia, calmly and clearly, as the new owner of the property. A hush fell, not the kind that comes with reverence, but the sharp kind that follows confusion. Darren stepped forward, demanding answers, but I only handed him a copy of the contract. Then I said, as evenly as I could manage, that they had 30 days to vacate, just like they gave me. At first, no one seemed to know how to react. Darren stood there, contract in hand, his mouth opening and closing like he was waiting for the right words to catch up to him. But there weren't any. His face lost its usual glow, the one he always wore when talking business or playing the charming host. It drained of color until he looked like a man who had just walked into the wrong house. Lena sat frozen, her hand still wrapped around the base of her wine glass. She hadn't even blinked. The guests, dressed in their party best, exchanged glances. Some looked at me with confusion, others with something close to embarrassment, as if they had walked into a scene they were never meant to witness. One woman stepped away from the table, clutching her purse tighter. Darren's parents were the last to react, still seated near the head of the patio, clearly unsure of what they'd missed. His mother asked him what was going on, but he didn't answer. I cleared my throat, not to demand attention, but to steady myself. I explained, simply and clearly, that the home had recently been sold. I introduced Sylvia again, noting her as the new legal owner. There was no drama in my voice, no gloating, just facts. I said that under the terms of the agreement, the occupants of the main house had 30 days to vacate. That's what the law allowed. That's what they had given me when they planned to send me to a retirement home. Darren finally spoke, voice raised slightly but cracking around the edges. He called it a misunderstanding. He said something about needing to consult a lawyer, but I had already anticipated that. Marcus had made sure everything was clean. Lena stood then, slowly, and took a few steps toward me. Her expression was not anger or shock, but something much harder to face. Recognition. The kind that comes when you finally realize the person you've overlooked has been watching you the entire time. "I didn't know," she said, almost a whisper. I looked her in the eye and nodded. "You didn't ask." That was all I said. The guests began to disperse. Some muttered apologies as they passed me, a few offering quiet nods of respect. Darren stormed off inside, leaving the contract on the table, forgotten in his rush to regain control of something he no longer owned. Lena stood in the yard, shoulders stiff, watching as Sylvia spoke kindly with a neighbor who had wandered over. I did not linger. I walked back to the guest house without a backward glance, letting the sounds of chairs scraping and low voices behind me dissolve into the evening air. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the scent of pine and salt from the inlet. It felt like the house was breathing again. For the first time in months, the silence wasn't lonely. It was mine. The next morning, I found the silence in the main house different. Not the brittle silence of tension or avoidance, but the heavy kind that comes when people finally understand that a decision is final. Darren didn't speak to me when I passed him in the hallway. He was on the phone, muttering about legal options, but his voice had lost its swagger. Lena was in the kitchen, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, packing dishes into boxes with the same hands that once helped me string lights along the porch every December. There was no ceremony to it, no shouting, no pleas, no last-minute efforts to change the outcome. Just the sound of cardboard unfolding and packing tape stretching across seams. I watched them from the archway, unseen for a few minutes before stepping outside. The same walkway they had rolled their suitcases down 3 months ago now saw them carrying out lamps and throw pillows, their belongings piling slowly in the trunk of Darren's SUV. It was a strange symmetry. The invasion reversed in slow motion. The kids had questions, of course. I overheard one of them ask if they were being kicked out. Lena didn't answer directly. She just said, "We're going to stay somewhere else for a little while," and kept folding towels. I wondered how much they understood, how much they'd remember. Children have a way of absorbing truths even when no one says them out loud. Just like I had when I was their age, sitting in rooms where grown-ups whispered behind doors. I spent the day in the garden, trimming back the azaleas and checking the trellis Carla had built with her own hands. The vines were starting to curl again, reaching for light. I moved slowly, letting the clippings fall gently into the wheelbarrow, breathing in the soil and the faint memory of her perfume still clinging to the old sun hat I wore out of habit. By late afternoon, I saw Darren drag the last suitcase out. He paused near the steps, probably expecting something, a word, a nod, some kind of signal that I might soften. But I didn't. Not because I wanted revenge, because I had already given enough. Lena came out behind him, carrying the framed photo of her and Carla that once sat on the mantel. She looked at me as if she might speak, but then glanced away. I wondered if she'd finally started to understand what it meant to lose something that couldn't be bought back. The car doors closed, the engine started, and just like that, they were gone. I didn't go into the house right away. I sat on the bench near the inlet, the one Carla and I used to sit on when we needed to think things through. The tide was low, the air was clean, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was nothing left I had to protect, only what I chose to keep. The house was still for 2 full days after they left. It wasn't empty, not really. Their furniture was gone, their smells too, but the walls still held the weight of what had passed. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it sit with me, like a guest who understood that saying nothing could sometimes mean more than speaking. On the 3rd morning, I walked into the living room. It was stripped bare except for one thing, Carla's chair. Somehow it had made its way back from the garage, a little dusty but upright, as if waiting for her. I stood in front of it for a long time. The indentation in the cushion still fit the curve of her frame. The armrests held faint marks where her fingers used to tap while she read. I lowered myself into it slowly, letting my body remember what it was to belong somewhere without question. From that chair I could see the garden, the driveway, the inlet in the distance. It was a good spot, still the best seat in the house. I pulled the blanket she used to keep folded on the side and laid it over my lap, more out of memory than chill. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself before each breath. I spent the next few days restoring what mattered. I put the porcelain angel back on the mantel. I unpacked the wedding photo and returned it to its rightful place above the fireplace. Carla's music box, the one I found chipped in the bottom drawer, sat on the coffee table now. When I wound it, the melody still played, off-kilter but familiar. I didn't fix the chip. It felt honest that way. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals, just enough for one, just how I liked it. I played Carla's records, the ones that had been stashed in the garage under yoga mats and tangled extension cords. I cleaned each one gently with a soft cloth, and as the crackling filled the room, I let myself remember things without flinching. Sylvia stopped by once just to check in. She didn't hover or ask too many questions. She simply asked if I needed anything. I told her I was good for now. She smiled and said she was glad the house felt lived in again. I could see the relief in her eyes. She'd bought a home, not a problem. That mattered to her, and it mattered to me. Later that night, I sat again in Carla's chair. The lights in the hallway were dim, just enough to soften the edges of the room. I imagined her beside me, not as a ghost, but as a presence. Her memory didn't hurt anymore. It steadied me. The house was quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was mine, fully, finally, and again. The days that followed weren't remarkable, at least not in the way people expect when a storm has passed. There was no triumphant music, no sudden burst of joy, just a quiet settling, like dust finally allowed to rest. I woke up each morning with the soft light spilling across the floorboards and the sound of the inlet brushing against the shore in the distance. No loud footsteps overhead, no lectures in the kitchen, no competing colognes clinging to the curtains. I had breakfast when I pleased. I sat on the back porch with my coffee, letting the air fill my lungs without bracing myself for a voice telling me I had left the door open too long or that the dog had gotten out again. The silence was full now, full of memory, full of presence, full of the kind of peace that you don't notice until it's gone, and then returned. There were moments, brief but honest, when I missed parts of them. The kids' laughter, even if it was often drowned by a screen. The shape of Lena's handwriting on notes left on the counter. Even Darren's voice, brash and overconfident, had its rhythm. But those moments passed like a breeze across the surface of a pond. They rippled, then settled, and the water cleared again. I started sorting through the attic, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Old letters, photos, keepsakes that had been packed away too long. Carla's handwriting on a grocery list brought me to tears more than once, not out of sorrow, but because it reminded me how well I had been loved. I found a birthday card from Lena when she was 8, still covered in glitter, still sweet and unfiltered. That version of her was still in there somewhere. I didn't hold anger against her anymore. I had simply let go of the idea that I had to carry her choices on my shoulders. Sylvia brought over some fresh lavender from her garden, said she thought it would do the guest house good. I placed it on the kitchen counter, and the scent brought Carla back again, not as a wound, but as a companion. I smiled more now, not for show, but because the heaviness had lifted. People around town started noticing. I wasn't hunched when I walked into the post office. I had more patience at the market. Ray said I looked taller, though I hadn't grown an inch. What he saw was something harder to name. I hadn't become someone new. I had returned to someone I had always been. I am still Walter Briggs, still the man who loved his wife, who built a life with his hands, who endured disappointment without letting it shape his soul. They tried to reduce me to an inconvenience, but I remembered who I was. And when the time came, I reminded them too, without shouting, without cruelty, and without needing to explain. One evening, not long after everything had settled, I stood on the porch of the guest house watching the last bit of sun bleed out over the inlet. The water reflected gold and lavender, and the tall grass near the edge of the bluff swayed like it remembered the way Carla used to walk through it with her sandals half off. That light, the one just before dark, had always been our favorite. It softened everything, even memory. I thought about the version of myself who stood in that same yard months ago, quietly being pushed aside, unsure whether anyone would ever hear him again. That man had waited too long, hoping for a change that never came. He had walked around his own house like a stranger, counting losses instead of planting new roots. But that man had also found resolve, and when the time came, he chose to act without bitterness. That made all the difference. I still don't know if Lena fully understood the weight of what she allowed to happen. Maybe one day she will. Maybe she already has. I haven't heard from her since the day they packed up the last of their things and drove off, though a small envelope arrived a week ago with no return address. Inside was a photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. Carla and Lena at the beach, toes in the sand, both smiling at something out of frame. No note, no explanation, just that image. I placed it in the hallway beside the photo of Carla and me on our 30th anniversary. It didn't need words. The guest house has become more than shelter. It's quiet, but not empty. Some evenings I light a candle and let Carla's records play. Sometimes I read aloud to the empty room, the way I used to when she was folding laundry or sitting cross-legged on the couch. The house doesn't feel like it's missing someone anymore. It feels like it's listening. Sylvia checks in now and then. We sit on the porch and drink tea, watching the water shift colors with the sky. She asked once if I would ever consider moving somewhere closer to town, maybe something smaller. I told her this was already small enough. Everything I needed fit into the life I had reclaimed. She nodded, and we let the silence say the rest. There's a freedom that comes from not needing to be anything more than yourself. Not a placeholder, not a burden, not a faded version of someone others think you once were. I earned that freedom, not through force, but by remembering my name, my place, my story. As the last light slipped behind the horizon and the air cooled with evening, I stood up and walked the short path toward the house. The door creaked just the way it used to, and for the first time in a long time when I stepped inside, I felt nothing but home.